The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
It's quite auspicious. Just a few minutes ago, the two astronauts who have been trapped on the International Space Station, Sunny Williams and Butch Wilmore, just splashed down off the coast of Florida. So it feels like a perfect time to talk about Samantha's stunning, beautiful book, Orbital. So thank you so much, Samantha, for joining us here tonight.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you all for being here. This is a somewhat daunting but amazing crowd.
Orbital is, I don't want to spoil this for anyone who hasn't read it. It's a book that's both easy to describe and very difficult to describe. It's about 6 astronauts and cosmonauts from 5 different countries, 4 men, 2 women, on board a space station over the course of a single day. And of course, that single day involves 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets. And it follows these 6 people doing both ordinary and extraordinary things. But the book is also a meditation on our relationship to one another, to the earth, to children and parents, and a sense of awe. Samantha, this is such an extraordinary setting and premise, and it's formally different than your previous novels. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the first seeds of Orbital, how this story first came to you.
Well, so it's interesting. I was thinking earlier about this. It occurred to me that the last time I was here in Toronto was in, I think it was 2016, it might have been 2017. And I kind of think that's where this novel first started, because I read, and this is going to sound completely eccentric, but I read a book, a novel called A Month in the Country, which some of you might know. It's very English, pastoral novel, I suppose, about a man's recovery after serving in the war, and he goes and lives in the English countryside for a month, and it's sort of about how nature aids our kind of mental and physical recovery, and it's a very, very quiet book. And I read it when I was here, and I remember sort of just reading. It's very short, and I got to the end, and I just started crying. I felt incredibly moved by it in a way I hadn't realized when I was actually reading it. And it really stayed with me, and I kept thinking, I want my next novel to have something of that quality about it, that sort of, I want to write something that feels quite pastoral and feels quite elegiac about the natural world, and feels sort of, has, by pastoral I suppose I mean, acknowledges the extraordinary beauty of the natural world, but also has a melancholy and a nostalgia about it, and the fact that things are being lost to us. And I couldn't find a way into it, so I've parked the idea for quite a long time and started writing other things which weren't working out. And then at some point, I think I was watching images of the Earth from space online. There were lots of amazing, I don't know if you haven't watched some of this footage, you should. It's just completely mesmerizing. And I was watching that, and I thought, I wonder if I could write a kind of space pastoral, whether I could write A Month in the Country in space. And that's how it started, really. And I thought, well, okay, I suppose we can write about the natural world from that vantage point of low Earth orbit, and space, after all, is also part of the natural world, and it is kind of our last remaining wilderness in some ways. Maybe there's something there that is sort of not really written about, nature writing from space. It hasn't really been done before. And then I thought, well, I need a locus for the book. It needs to be set somewhere, so it seemed obvious that it should be the ISS or my kind of fictional equivalent of it. And then that got me thinking, that's also extraordinary that nobody has has sort of written about space as a domestic, lived, realist environment. I hadn't come across any other realist novel about space. It's all sci-fi usually, and a projection of our fears onto space, and sort of plot-driven, usually catastrophic narrative. So then it all just kind of started to come into focus for me, and I thought there's something here that could be quite interesting to embark on. So I did, and because I was basically wanting to write a month in the country in space, the book was originally set over a month, which I then realized was ridiculous. It wasn't working, and I'd written a whole draft. In fact, I think I'd written 2 drafts, and I couldn't make it work. And then I realized I had to leave a month in the country behind, and it should just be set over one day. And when I decided that, and I realized I could articulate everything I wanted to say about this kind of weird explosion of time that happens when you're circling the Earth 16 times, then I could sort of embed some of that subject into the structure of the book. Then the whole thing began to align.
Mm-hmm. And when you first started imagining the lives of these 6 people on board a space station, how far into beginning to think about the characters and what their lives look like did you start actually doing the research of what their lives would be like, what it would be like to pass a day or several months? And how much did that differ from what you imagined? Or did you come across something that was sort of stranger than you could have even conjured up when it came to the reality of their lives?
I mean, I couldn't write a single sentence of this book without research, so I started researching it before I started writing, because I just didn't know anything about it, really. This is very typical of me. My last novel was set in 1491. I didn't know anything about this time period. Nothing. I started with, a children's picture book about the Middle Ages, and worked up from there. So I had to start from scratch. So everything was kind of a surprise to me. I started. I knew they floated, but I didn't really know why they floated. I mean, and in fact, it's not even that obvious. They float because there's very little gravity. But I didn't really know why there was very little gravity, because they're not very far from the Earth, but they're floating because they're falling. They're in a state of constant free fall around the Earth, which I find really fascinating. So there were things like that were kind of wonderful to me. The fact that they're in this continual, when you're on a roller coaster and you suddenly start descending, and that moment where you lift out of your seat, that's why they're floating, because they're in that constant moment of plummet. That was really amazing to me, and almost everything that I researched was amazing to me, and I just kept thinking, this is a boundless treasure trove of material for a novelist, and I had that fear of, this such and now I've thought about it, it's such an obvious thing to write about. I hope nobody else is writing about it right now.
Wouldn't that be terrible if 2 space station novels came out in the same year?
This is always a novelist's fear, that someone else is somewhere else writing more quickly than you are. The same thing.
And did you ever feel limited by, when I think about all the details, the fact that you're always congested in space? I mean, were those just always gems, or was there anything that you had to write around, some factual, some detail, some fact that hamstrung you a little bit? I mean, I thought it was amazing that people were receiving care packages. I mean, just all of the sense of how distant they are from the Earth, and yet so bound at the same time.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I don't think there was anything that I felt, I'm going to have to fudge that because that doesn't really work. Mm-hmm. There were some things, I guess, that I was less interested in, or they were just less relevant than other things. But I think on the whole, everything just felt so kind of rich with possibility, and it was more a question of what do I leave out? Where do I stop researching? What do I do with the things I've researched? How do I translate from fact to sort of imagination to how do you alchemize fact into fiction? Because I felt that I wanted to write something that didn't feel too essayistic. It didn't feel like I'd done loads of research. It felt like a novel. It felt like a world that could be, in some sense, spellbinding. And that's something I always think about when I write. Sort of how do I create a spell that I can invite the reader into, and that I won't break until the novel's over, So it was, and sometimes the intrusion of fact, and particularly, technical fact, can break that spell. So that was more my concern, how do I keep this kind of rich with fact, because the facts are the kind of amazing, nutrient base of this novel, but also spellbinding and suspenseful. If you've read the book, you'll know it's not suspenseful in a plot sense, but suspenseful in another way, where the narrative from the beginning sort of takes you up, lifts you up, and sort of holds you there until you finish the book. That was what was on my mind.
I wanted to get back to what you said about the space pastoral, that the idea that this would be, because it really is such a beautiful ode to Earth, and the astronauts' ties to their home, and it's, again, I don't want to give too much away, but it comes fairly early in the novel. But, these astronauts are suspended like gods, in a way, above the Earth, but they're watching a typhoon. And it struck me that it was quite moving, this idea that with all this ability to try to control and contain nature, they were looking down on the fact that nature cannot be contained and controlled. And I'm wondering when you knew, because again, this is not a heavy plot-driven novel. This is much more meditative. When did you think about having the typhoon? Like, was it sort of you watching something that actually happened here, or when did that come to you, and why was that important to have that typhoon in the novel?
Yeah, I was looking for something that I could use that would articulate sort of the passage of this one day. So something that would take roughly a day to happen, or could sort of meaningfully happen in that one day, that wasn't at a human scale. I really wanted this novel to be, it has human scale. It has the 6 astronauts, cosmonauts in it, and they do matter, but they're not the center of the book. They're part of it. They're part of a much bigger picture. And so I wanted something that was working at a non-human scale, a sort of much grander scale. So I was sort of thinking, what could it be? And originally I thought, could it be some sort of animal migration that they can see? But a day wasn't long enough for that. So I eventually decided on this typhoon, because when you watch a typhoon from low Earth orbit, the video footage of them is really astonishing. They're really beautiful. And of course, if you're on the ground experiencing a typhoon, it's really not beautiful. And I was kind of struck by that dissonance, the fact that from that short distance of low Earth orbit, because they're only 250 miles above the Earth, the flank of the Earth that you can see when there's a typhoon is entirely taken up with that typhoon. You can't see anything else. The whole planet is just one kind of weather system. And I thought that was, it's so sort of wonderful to see it, and so not wonderful to live it. And so that seemed like a really good symbol. And I suppose that also, although I don't think this book is, about climate change, but of course, if you're looking at the Earth from above, you're going to see the effects of climate change. So I thought that image of a typhoon, which they see build into a super typhoon that's going to hit the Philippines, was sort of just a way of looking at climate and what we're doing to our climate, and just sort of saying something about it, but purely in images.
Mm-hmm. In a similar way, this book isn't about politics, but, rereading it over the last month, as I did, you have this group of people from 5 different countries. These are highly capable people who are also vulnerable and they have this interdependence that they need to survive. And I think reading it at this moment when we're seeing this rise of authoritarianism and isolationism, it's hard not to almost see this world that is created in the space station as something, perhaps something hopeful, something about possibility, alongside, what we're experiencing right now. And I'm wondering, for you, have you reflected on that change that we've seen from the time you were writing Orbital to the current, situations in the world we're living through right now?
Yeah, definitely. So when I started writing it, and with a little bit of research, I began to see that, you have this, the ISS is this kind of symbol in a way of an era that is disappearing from view. Maybe we could say it's disappeared from view now, which is it was a kind of a post-Cold War attempt at peace and at collaboration, and it is a collaboration of, I think it's 17 different nations, and it's been an incredibly successful kind of experiment in international cooperation. And I felt that really palpably when I was writing the book. And I wrote the book before Russia invaded Ukraine, but even before that, it was very obvious that the relationship between Russia and the West was breaking down. And yet they all were still cooperating on this spacecraft, if only for expediency, because they kind of have to. They, as you say, they're completely interdependent. But still, it seemed to me that there's this, when we have a need, when we recognize our dependence on one another, it's a very powerful thing. When we recognize we can't just go it alone, that we're not, each nation is not kind of independent from every other nation, then we have to coexist peacefully. We have to find a way of doing that. So I kind of see, although there's maybe I'm a novelist and I'm a bit sentimental, so I can see it's a slightly romanticized vision of it, but I kind of see that spacecraft as this sort of beautiful symbol of peace that is coming to the end of its life. I mean, it was anyway going to be deorbited. It has a shelf life because it's going at 17,500 miles an hour and it can't keep doing that forever. But I think that's, it's hastened now by the fact that those relations have really broken down between Russia and the West. And I see that with the kind of sadness. I was speaking to a NASA astronaut who was sort of slightly befriended, and I was saying, I feel quite sad about the ISS being deorbited. Do you? And she'd lived on it for 6 months, and she was like, no, I don't feel sad at all. It's just
Why was that? Why wasn't she sentimental about it?
I think astronauts, it seems to me from my little bit of contact with them, they're almost pathologically optimistic in a way I find quite strange. And she just seemed to think that this was an opportunity to do bigger things, those bigger things being going back to the moon and going to Mars, which I think, why bother? That's me. That's why I'm not an astronaut. That's why I just sit writing about it.
That's why you're earthbound.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, similar to that idea of this kind of, this lovely short-term world that they've created. There's also sort of a theme that feels sort of linked to that in a kind of this sort of innocence that they also experience. I mean, they talk about themselves almost entering a childlike state. And again, these are 6 of, these are fictionalized characters, but the kind of people who go who become astronauts and cosmonauts are, highly rational, deeply qualified, extremely cool under pressure types of people. And yet there's something about their experience that allows them to take on an almost childlike state in sort of around the dreaminess of their world, but also in, I guess, seeing Earth from its perspective. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that, the theme of that kind of child and parent. It also plays out in the lives of some of the characters, their relationships to their own family. But I think most especially the idea of Earth as this sense of home or mother, or, especially when your umbilical cord is like severed and you're so far away from your home base.
Yeah, I think that, so there's a lot in this book that I had to make up because I'm not an astronaut, and there are some things that you can't really access in all the reading I did and the research I did. You never really can get to what astronauts really think about things. They don't really tell you. And so I didn't know that there's sort of this, as you say, there's kind of one particular bit in the book, but I think it runs all the way through thematically of them sort of feeling almost childlike. And this came from, I have no idea if they do feel that. They may say, absolutely not, But I remember watching them, watching videos of them floating around. And they're in their little shorts. They're all wearing the same things. And they're floating around, sucking drinks from straws. And I just thought they kind of look like children, and there's something very innocent about it all.
Mm-hmm.
That they have their jobs to do each day, and there's this kind of dutiful innocence about the way they appear, even if that's not how it is really. And I thought it was kind of really endearing, a sort of thought or image that you have these, as you say, incredibly competent people who, have had to beat thousands of others in order to get to where they are now. And yet, we are all kind of rendered childlike, ultimately, we're all just trying to find our way, and we're all somewhat lost in this world at some level, and everybody I know, including myself, is sort of still waiting to feel like a proper adult. And I felt there was something in there, sort of a kind of innocence and in the face of the beauty of the Earth, and in the face of the improbability of the Earth, and the fact that this planet is our spaceship, it's our home, it's all we have. There is a sort of, an almost mute staring and just bewilderment and of baffled awe, and I had to surmise that they must at least sometimes feel that.
Mm-hmm. We were talking in the back about your memoir that came out in 2020 about insomnia. It was called The Shapeless Unease. And I've read that you drew a bit of that sort of experience. I've also struggled with insomnia. I think anyone who has knows that sort of strange suspended state, that dreamlike state, that sort of liminal space as you're waiting, and that kind of lost time space, which is also what these characters experience, how dislocated they are from time, because they're experiencing sunrise, sunset over the course of the day. They sort of need to sleep, but everything that would tether them to their circadian rhythm is gone. Could you talk a bit about how you maybe drew from some of that sense of your experience of insomnia to think about some of that physical reality for the astronauts? Is it fair to say that there is some similarity there, or something you could draw on to think about what that state would be like for them?
I think that there's so much in common between Orbital and that memoir about insomnia, probably more than there is in common between Orbital and my previous novels in a lot of ways. But I think that maybe it isn't in those particular ways. I'm sure having insomnia kind of helped me to know what it's like for day and night to be upended, you know, and I think that must be true at some level. But also in all of my novels, I've always been interested from the very beginning in time and our experience of time, and how you can write about that in narrative, and how kind of amazing the novel is as a form in its kind of articulation of time, and the way that it can push and pull time and play with it, and deal with sort of fragmentation and the non-linear nature of time and all of that. So I've really explored that in, I think, all of my novels in some ways. You know, my last novel, The Western Wind, is sort of told backwards over the course of 4 days, and also has a kind of circular chapter structure. So I was trying to say something about the circular nature of time, you know, as it can be experienced. And so I'm always trying to think about how the novel might do that, and it seems to be a preoccupation of mine, maybe the central preoccupation. So in a sense, that wasn't born of having had insomnia. But I think what I wouldn't have done in this book if I hadn't sort of become an insomniac. I like the sort of idea of becoming an insomniac, if it's an achievement. But
some are born to insomnia.
Yeah.
Some have insomnia thrust upon them.
Exactly. Is this kind of, I don't know, maybe it's sort of, I'm sure it's not good for my brain what's happened through sleeplessness, but it's quite creatively useful. Because it sort of has given me this almost manic focus. I don't know how to explain it really, but I find that since having insomnia, I write in a more focused but in more instinctive way. I write things that are more compressed and more intense, and my concentration span is shorter, but while it's alive, it's alive. It's really quite kind of electric and manic. And there was something about writing that memoir, The Shapeless Unease, which I hadn't really meant to write, but just kind of came out in this sort of urgent, kind of wild mess, because I was so sleep deprived, and writing was my way of, I guess, trying to dream, I think, because I wasn't really dreaming. It was a way of sort of doing dream work, I think. And then I realized through that process that writing was so, it's going to sound really pretentious, but it's heartfelt. It's so necessary to me that I couldn't live without it. When I was in the depths of desperate sleep deprivation, it was writing that I needed to do, not anything else. And I thought, well, it's really interesting to know that. That's kind of good news, given my choice of career. And I thought, well, okay, I want to try and bring some of that across into whatever I write next. I didn't know at that point it would be Orbital, but I want to try and harness some of that instinctive energy, and not think so carefully in some ways about what I'm writing, but just go with it. And I think that's why Orbital has this greater variety of voices and tones that my other novels don't. Where I've always tended with the other ones to choose one point of view and to tell the whole novel through that one point of view, which I'm really interested in, and I'm sure I'll come back to that. But it just seemed that there was much more I wanted to do with this. I wanted to have the freedom to go wherever I wanted to go. So zoom in, zoom out, occupy multiple characters' heads, express ideas through different media, and there were all sorts of strange approaches in this. Lots of lists, and a chapter about this, the idea of the cosmic calendar, where it just goes a bit wild. And to try and expand and compress time, see if I could create a bit of narrative propulsion through doing that, through sort of, expanding particular moments and then compressing others. And I think all of that came came from this new kind of wiring in my brain that has developed from lack of sleep, which I'm kind of grateful for. Still,
well, something very wonderful came out of the insomnia, so we're grateful. I just wanted to. I think I have time for one more question, and then I want to open it up to the floor and to the audience Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, get ready. I was struck by, the deep sense of spirituality, and I don't mean to be sort of gooey about that word, but this really is a novel about awe, impermanence, sense of self coming together and dissolving, what it means to be separate, what it means to be in community, and then again this extraordinary setting of, being in this wilderness of space, and feeling both small and enormous. There's a great scene when I think it's Nell sort of puts her foot over one country or a hand over another, just the idea of, there is your home, but it's also, the perspective of it is so different. And I don't know if you are somebody who is a spiritual or religious person, but certainly the book is imbued with a sense of awe and wonder. And hearing you talk about the research and, when you talked about the typhoon, I'm struck by how much you continue to experience that sense of awe about, this setting. Could you talk a bit about, how you got that sense of awe or spirituality, or however you might describe it for the book?
Yeah, I suppose I probably should have said this much earlier, but the book for me is definitely an emotional project more than it is a cerebral project or intellectual. It was sort of born of feeling, and that feeling was one of absolute love for the earth, I suppose, a love for the natural world. I don't mean that in a sentimental way particularly, but a feeling of just, as you say, of awe, of being overwhelmed by the beauty of this planet that is our home, which is very, it becomes ever more obvious when you look at it from a distance, because you see, you see how brightly it glows in space. And it looks rather unearthly, in fact. And you can see the atmosphere, this tiny, thin line of the atmosphere, which is what makes life possible here. And I felt something when I was looking at that was almost like being in love. It was a sort of very expanded, kind of oxygenated feeling of absolute beauty. And that's what I wanted to articulate more than anything. I didn't have any agenda with the book except to try to put into words that feeling. And so I don't know if that's a sort of a spiritual project or not. You mentioned having done a silent retreat.
Meditation retreat,
and I've done some of those with varying degrees of, I'll say success. I mean, we're not supposed to talk about success when it comes to these things.
But sometimes it can feel very unsuccessful.
It can feel really unsuccessful. Yeah, it can. When you're crying at 3 a.m.
Exactly.
Planning your escape feels quite unsuccessful.
Exactly. Yes, it's a good thing your car keys are locked away somewhere, otherwise you'd be climbing out the window.
Exactly. But I suppose that I just I am, or at least try to be alive to experience, I suppose. And I wanted this book to try to articulate that, and I wanted it also to be quite painterly in its project, to feel as much like a painting as it does a novel, and in other ways to be quite musical, and to I'm not musical, I have absolutely no musical talent, but I think music is one of my main inspirations. I think about music a lot, and I think about my novels quite musically in terms of how they would feel if they were a piece of music, how they would sound, what I would want to evoke with them. So I was trying to do all sorts of things with it that were not limited to the novel, I suppose, that could encompass this huge feeling that I had when I looked at those images of the Earth from space, and to see, since words are really all I have, to see if I might do justice to that in words.
Thank you.